Thank you very much, Dr. Lowen, for the introduction, and I'd like to thank CMDA for the invitation to present. It's an honor, and I'm really looking forward to our interaction this evening. I've been asked to address the issue of physician-assisted death, and this evening what I'd like to do is just to give an account of how I came to explain my own opposition to assisted death. I think it's a concern or an opposition to assisted death that many of us share as Christians. And the challenge that we have is to explain that opposition to our colleagues, our friends, our family, to be able to faithfully bear witness to why this is something that we oppose and to cast a vision for a better way. And so that's our task this evening. That's what I want to address in about 35 minutes or so, and then look forward to interaction and insights from all of you as well after that. I do want to highlight a couple of potential financial conflicts of interest. I won't quote directly from these works this evening, but I'll mention them at the end. But I do receive royalties from, not very much in the way of royalties, to be honest, but some from a book I published with Lexham Press called How Should We Then Die? And then I also co-authored a catechism on death and dying with my pastor, and the royalties from that go to my church. So just want to highlight those as potential conflicts of interest for this presentation. All right, so at the outset, a word about terminology. What are we referring to when we express concern about physician-assisted death? We're expressing concern about the set of actions that involve deliberately causing death. So those are practices that are collectively referred to as medical aid in dying, assisted suicide, euthanasia, and physician-assisted death. Those are the common names for these practices. Of course, euthanasia and assisted suicide technically refer to slightly different things. Euthanasia, where the lethal dose of drug is directly administered to the patient by the healthcare professional, whereas assisted suicide, of course, is where the physician prescribes the lethal drug to the patient and the patient self-ingests. But in as much as all of these actions involve a healthcare professional deliberately facilitating death or deliberately aiming to cause death, we can kind of group them together. And I'll just be referring to these as assisted death or euthanasia together for simplicity. By contrast, what we're not opposing or not really talking about here this evening are end-of-life care procedures or decisions or aspects of management that do not involve deliberately aiming to cause death. So as an ICU physician, I'm regularly involved in withholding or withdrawing life-sustaining measures, or providing palliative care, or even rarely terminal sedation. And insofar as in none of those practices are we deliberately trying to cause the patient's death, and certainly the patient's death is not deemed a sort of successful outcome of the action. Those really are fundamentally and categorically different. So I want to draw that sharp distinction at the outset. We're really this evening talking about why we oppose actions that deliberately aim at causing death. Now, I'm fortunate to be speaking to an audience of fellow Canadian physicians this evening, and we all know intimately from firsthand experience just how rapidly this practice has progressed in Canada since it was first legalized. You know, in 2013 and 2014, there was widespread public discussion, growing enthusiasm for assisting death. I can still remember the first time being at a medical conference in Toronto and hearing somebody publicly advocate for causing the death of a patient. And it was just a shocking, head-spinning moment in the fall of 2014. Just a few months later, the Carter versus Canada decision came down, striking down the criminal prohibition on physician-assisted death. And a year later, the Canadian government legalized the practice, changed the law legislatively, and then a few years later, changed the law further to permit euthanasia for persons for whom death was not reasonably foreseeable, namely people with disabilities. And so, you know, in fact, there's more recent numbers than this now. I need to update this figure, but every year the practice has grown by leaps and bounds as it's progressively embraced by Canadian society. And increasingly, I know in my own personal and professional atmospheres, and I'm sure many of you would feel the same way, that this has sort of touched everybody, that most of us have people in our church whose family members are talking about MAID or have sought MAID. Many of us have colleagues in that we know who will refer for assisted death or even administer it. And so this is all around us. It's really in the water now, and it's become an ongoing topic of national conversation. When it was first um, sort of enthusiastically endorsed by the public and even by the medical profession, although, technically the profession announced a position of official neutrality, but that really meant that they weren't opposed, and therefore we're happy to get behind those who are strongly advocating for it. And when they first came out in endorsement of it, the case for assisted death seemed deceptively simple. This was about patients. Causing death was patient-centered. It was about empowering patients, giving them choices at the end of life. It was about respecting their autonomy and their right to self-determination. It was about giving them freedom from suffering. It was about recognizing that medicine can't fix everything, being realistic, and empowering patients. It was about compassion. And in particular, if people said, why not? Why not do this? They saw the traditional prohibition on causing death as something that was just a matter of mere tradition and nothing deeper under that. And my own close colleague and friend, James Downer, was involved in advocating for the practice. And he put it very simply to say this was about care, compassion, and respect. And with that kind of argument, being framed in such clear and simple terms, became very difficult for those of us who oppose this practice to push back, and in particular, to push back in a way that allowed us to speak to people who did not share our Christian commitments, our religious commitments, or our quote unquote worldview. So I, practicing critical care physician and clinician scientist, I spend most of my time studying mechanical ventilation and its deleterious effects and how we can prevent them. I study respiratory muscle physiology, and back in 2013, 2014, when this was first coming out, I was in the thick of my graduate studies. I really had no background or involvement in ethics at all, but really, I think like so many um, Canadian Christian physicians confronted by this question of how do I explain to other people why I would say no? And in particular, how do I explain to people why I would not even refer for this practice? Many people seem to understand that a physician wouldn't want to do it themselves necessarily, but somewhat inconsistently, they would have a harder time refusing to even refer a patient. And so, where all of my colleagues were, or many of them were publicly declaring their professional support, suddenly those of us who refused to be involved found ourselves swimming against the moral tide. And the question was, how do we say no? And in that sense, recognizing that I would have to give an account that, like all of us, about why I would not be involved, became engaged in this issue, writing about it, talking about it, and advocating against it. And in particular, because I practice critical care and we're regularly involved in the care of end of life patients at the end of life, I anticipated that from time to time, at least, this issue would be raised in my practice, that I would need to be ready to deal with it. And it was a time of, I think, as for many of us, some fear and intimidation, the sense that our practices could be seriously impaired. We could we could face disciplinary consequences for refusing to participate. And so there was a lot of pressure to be able to explain why I wouldn't be involved. Another reason that as a critical care physician, I felt compelled to become involved is that many people were arguing that withholding or withdrawing life-sustaining measures was essentially the moral equivalent of euthanasia. And so, insofar as was intimately familiar with that and wanted to be able to defend that practice, I felt I had to be able to say something about why these two are not the same. And so, for many of you, I know that many of you in this audience were involved in the advocacy work, seeking freedom of conscience in medicine, and involved in the suit of the College of Physicians in Ontario and elsewhere. And sadly, we lost both court cases despite the faithful witness of and compelling witness of Christian physicians. And that left us in a difficult position. And while we've been able to find, many of us been able to find sort of space to be able to practice, even under this expectation of an effective referral, the question remains, how do we explain to other people why we won't refer? How do we defend our conscientious objection? Is this just a deeply personal, selfish matter of personal values? How do we give an account for why we oppose this practice? And I think greatly complicating this is a deeper underlying issue, which is that we live in a time where there is no accepted moral authority. Um, Philosophers have described the kind of contemporary moral milieu of the late modern West as pluralistic or emotivistic. And the term emotivism is one that gets used to describe the way in which, for many people, moral beliefs, moral claims, moral rules are essentially reducible to the kind of gut instinct or emotion. They're simply an expression of how you feel. And the problem with that is that if you try to engage somebody about why something's right or wrong, as soon as it becomes a matter of how you both feel, essentially the conversation's over because there's no basis for rational dialogue. There's no grounds for back and forth. And in a society where there's no accepted single overarching moral authority, when we disagree morally, to what moral authority may we appeal? And for many people, the highest moral authority is the individual, the quote unquote autonomy. And so people making decisions for themselves, functioning as their own authority, became, essentially the only authority for making a moral deliberation. And so this challenge of finding, is there a common moral starting point from which we can dialogue about why we think this is wrong that doesn't merely reduce to how I feel versus how you feel? That was the challenge. And a kind of early representation of the struggle to wrestle with this issue is a short article I was privileged to write with Stephen Wong, an internist in Toronto, um, talking about this idea of how the death of God sort of entailed the death of morality, and so that apart from theism and even Christian belief, it'd be difficult to explain why this is wrong. This was kind of my early thinking about the issue. I think another challenge to Christian physicians trying to defend their opposition is that any attempt to refer to your own religious beliefs was regarded as a form of selfish conflict of interest. Um, Religious beliefs function not as grounds for moral deliberation, but rather as a kind of a conflict, an interference with your reason as to what is right and wrong. So, if I was to defend my opposition to euthanasia on the basis of Christianity, people would say, well, that's simply you appealing to your own personal beliefs. As Wayne Sumner here puts it, faith-based premises that are shared only by some, and therefore don't give you any basis to impose your beliefs on other people. And so you even have fairly prominent academics, medical academics in the United Kingdom, Richard Smith and Jane Blaisby, calling for religious belief to be declared as a competing interest when you're writing about issues like assisted dying, which really basically completely compromises your position if you basically say this is my position's grounded purely in my personal subjective religious beliefs. So how do we overcome this? How do we bridge this divide such that we can have a meaningful moral conversation? And over time, as I read and thought and studied the work of other people, it sort of became increasingly clear that there is very much a way in which the scripture affirms that as creatures made in God's image, we have a deep knowledge of right and wrong. What one Christian philosopher refers to as what we can't not know. And this is the idea that even while people disagree about what is right and wrong, very few people would ever say that it doesn't matter whether you're good or bad. And that really wasn't the issue in the assisted death debate. The debate was about what was good, but nobody disagreed about the fact that you ought to be good. Moreover, nobody really disagreed about the idea that you need to be rational or just and fair in your treatment of people. And even nobody really disagreed about the notion that people mattered. Nobody was arguing for assisted death from the starting point that said that people don't matter, so we can just kill them. That was never the reasoning. So rooted deeply within our fellow human creatures, even those who are not regenerate, who haven't been brought to spiritual life by the work of the Spirit, who remain blinded by sin. There is nevertheless a deep knowledge of right and wrong that makes them answerable and accountable to God. And Romans 2:14 says, "For when Gentiles who do not have the law by nature do what the law requires, they are a law to themselves, even though they do not have the law." And our task then is to appeal to that knowledge and to show using reason and careful deliberation how it's the case that our position accords with goodness and justice and fairness and rationality and the value of the human person. That's what I want to set out to do. And what I want to point out is that these arguments that were offered in favor of euthanasia are all grounded in the idea that people matter. So we're talking about being patient-centered. That's predicated in the assumption that patients really matter. Talking about empowering people. This is based on the idea that you do good for people by increasing their choice. So again, this was about doing good for people, about honoring people. There was a lot of talk, of course, about dignity, which in turn is about honoring the value of people. And so in as much as the case for euthanasia was grounded in the idea that people matter, well, our task becomes to show that actually euthanasia undermines rather than honors the value of people. And in so doing, that enables us to take the moral high ground. Let me show you exactly how this works. So I want to walk through three aspects, three forms of recognition that enable us to see clearly that euthanasia is not only wrong, but foolish. And in doing so, I think we make a very strong case for our opposition to this practice. So first, this is a matter of recognizing the true nature of human value. So there are different forms of value, and I go into this in some detail in my book, but the point here is that there are basically two fundamental types of value that you can distinguish between extrinsic value and intrinsic value. And there's various labels for these terms, instrumental value and inherent value, etc. But I find the extrinsic intrinsic distinction the clearest. Extrinsic value is value from your usefulness, from what you can do. Intrinsic value is value that comes from what you are. And a kind of simplistic analogy would be an Apple device. If I use my iPhone, carry it with me everywhere, uh, have it near my bedstand at night in case I get a phone call, look at it when I wake up in the morning, probably too much. And it's something that if somebody saw my life, they would say, hey, wow, that guy really thinks this thing is of great value. But the second it breaks, I promise you, I'm going to replace it with a new one because the only value that that phone has is from what it can do, its usefulness. It has purely extrinsic value. By contrast, something like the Mona Lisa, which clearly people from all over the world come to see, it's cared for with great care. It's protected, and if anyone was to deface the Mona Lisa, they would be hopefully universally reviled because the Mona Lisa doesn't do anything for anybody really. But of course, it has an aesthetic effect. But really, what makes the Mona Lisa matter is what it is, and even what it represents. But the value lies in the thing itself. Another example of something that would have a lot of intrinsic value would be an heirloom from your grandparents, say some World War II memorabilia. Not particularly useful, might gather dust in your attic, but you would never sell it or part with it because of what it represents. It has value just because of what it is. And I would argue that of all the things in this world that matter, humans are the highest example of intrinsic value. People matter not because of what they can do, but simply because of who and what they are. And the way we recognize that intrinsic value is from the fact that people are priceless and they are irreplaceable. You cannot put a price on somebody. This is, of course, what makes slavery and human trafficking so abhorrent is that it treats people as if they have extrinsic value. It fails to treat them in accordance with their true value. People are irreplaceable. You cannot switch one person for another. There's an individual uniqueness that makes that person of intrinsic value. And because they have intrinsic value, it means they matter by virtue of what they are, not by virtue of what they can do. And so that their value is unconditional. It doesn't vary, it doesn't change. It's a part and parcel of who and what they are. And once we understand and reflect on the true nature of human value, when we say that people matter, we flesh out what we really mean. We start to realize that has implications for how we view their existence. So, to say that something is valuable, to say that it matters, is also to say that it's a good thing that it exists. And if something has intrinsic and inherent value, then its existence is inherently good. It's unconditionally good that it exists because it has unconditional value. And the moment that you say to someone, your existence is not good, your existence does not have value, and you symbolize that stance by taking action to end their existence, you are at the same time saying that you have lost your value. So you cannot reconcile a support for the intrinsic value of people, recognizing that they're priceless and irreplaceable, with a willingness to deliberately end them. That's an inherent and profound and irreconcilable contradiction. And what we're really doing when we offer to cause someone's death, when a physician says to a patient, have you considered euthanasia? Or when the patient asks the doctor for euthanasia and then the patient provides it to them, or the physician provides it to them, what that physician is doing is calling into question the value of that person's existence. If your existence doesn't matter, you don't matter. And one of this really was driven home for me one day when I was had the privilege of testifying in 2020 before the Canadian Senate about Bill C-14, which was the legislation that expanded eligibility for euthanasia to include persons with disabilities. And Nick's testifying in the same Zoom room, everything was virtual at the time, were these two women who had profound visible disabilities. And as we were testifying against the law, I was testifying from the perspective of the fact that the law failed to protect physician conscience. So the law presented a threat to my practice, but I realized that for these very brave women testifying next to me, the law actually represented a threat to their existence. Once that law passed and once that legislation went into law, the value of their life in the eyes of the law was no longer unconditional, whereas mine remained unconditionally valuable. It remained absolutely wrong to cause my death, but would no longer be absolutely wrong to cause their. It was contingent only on their continued wish to live, essentially. And what does that say about our respective value in the eyes of the law and in the eyes of Canadian society? What struck me was it was such a profound example of the way in which a willingness to cause someone's death necessarily demeans and denies their value. These women would no longer be untouchable under the law. They would now be regarded as potentially disposable. And that was a profound denial of the true depth of their intrinsic value. Now, of course, some try to respond and say, well, we're talking about people getting value from their own autonomy. They decide if their value is if they matter or not. And so I'm honoring their wishes and respecting their person by honoring and empowering their autonomy. And so this idea that you can establish your own value on the basis of your own autonomy. But the fundamental problem with that, as we're learning in Canada, is that that's an unbearable weight that nobody can bear. Humans by nature are frail, weak, and dependent, and we need recognition and value from other people in order to see our own value. And if we were to assert our own value and to establish our own value on the basis of merely our own preferences, wishes, and desires, then the question becomes, why should anybody be concerned with what I want? Why should my autonomy be respected? So very quickly becomes clear that this is a frail, fragile, and crumbling foundation upon which to build human value. Okay, so those are some reflections on the nature of autonomy. I want to move quickly to a brief discussion about the implications of recognizing the value of the human body. Now, it's ironic because of all the people in the world, you would expect physicians who have spent, their livelihoods dedicated to the good of the body to view the body, the human body, as if it was of great value. But what's so striking about the euthanasia procedure is that it constitutes a direct assault on the body. So we do good for the patient, quote unquote, giving the patient what they want by giving them midazolam, propofol, rocuronium, lidocaine, and bupivacaine, or potassium chloride in doses that we would never ordinarily give to a patient, with the explicit stated goal of destroying the body. And it came home to me one day as I was speaking to a group about euthanasia and describing the euthanasia procedure, how profoundly absurd it was to claim that you could do someone good by destroying their body. And how striking it was that we would separate ourselves from our bodies, that the body is something that you could destroy even while you're doing the person good. That only makes sense if people are not bodies, if there's some kind of strange separation between the person and the body. And I think, and I cannot overemphasize the moral and philosophical significance of these issues around the relationship between persons and their bodies. I would say that we live in a time of anthropological crisis, and this touches on so many issues, not merely euthanasia, but also abortion, in vitro fertilization, surrogacy, gender issues, um, uh, social justice issues of all sorts. All of them, in my view, tie back to a fundamental failure to understand the true nature of the human person. And euthanasia is a kind of paradigm case of what Robert George calls a resurgent Gnosticism that separates the person from their body and sees the body as a mere extrinsic tool. You also hear this kind of language in sort of transhumanist conversations. Paul Ramsey, who was a prescient moral theologian at Princeton in the 1960s and 1970s, in many ways the father of modern bioethics, he described the central problem of ethics in the modern West as the death of the bond of soul with body and the understanding of personal life in a dualistic age. So many of the ethical issues that we wrestle with in medicine as physicians go back to the death of the bond of soul with body. Alistair MacIntyre, a well-known moral philosopher, now emeritus from Notre Dame, described the issue as essentially the fact that our society forgets the body. We forget that we are embodied creatures, and so many of our social failures reflect this failure. And I think once we see this, then we start to realize, wow, one reason to oppose euthanasia is that it completely devalues the body. I refer to euthanasia as an act of desecration because it literally destroys something sacred. You consider the following syllogism: people are bodies as well as souls. People matter. And therefore, if people are bodies and people matter, then bodies matter. We need to recover the notion that the human body is a sacredness. And just like, desecrating the Mona Lisa would be a great evil, even far greater evil, something that I think we completely take for granted because we have forgotten just how much the body matters, is to desecrate the human body. Matthew Lee Anderson, a Christian moral theologian, writes that suicide is incoherent because it severs a person from the basis for that individual's very self. You're destroying your body, and in doing so, you're destroying any real basis for your own existence. And of course, as Christians, we have a concept of the soul separated from the body for a time, because and in the intermediate state. But the gospel hope is not merely that our souls are saved, but that our bodies are saved, our bodies resurrected, and we will live as embodied beings forever with the Lord, who is Himself an embodied being. And so we have a very high view of the body as Christians. We can talk about that more afterwards, but I think that point cannot be overemphasized enough that in recovering a high view of the body will realize just how wrong euthanasia is. Thirdly, I think it's important to emphasize and recognize the way that euthanasia involves the exercise of blind faith. And I'm only going to touch on this very briefly, but it's really profound and striking. You have to remember that the logic of euthanasia is based on the idea that someone can decide that they're better off dead than alive. And when you read the philosophers who advocate for the practice, they imagine it as something akin to weighing up the goods of being alive and the harms of being alive. And if the harms of being alive outweigh the goods, well, then it's rationally defensible to choose to be dead because you're better off dead than alive. And so you'll have concepts of sometimes people will speak of a fate worse than death with respect to a certain severe outcome. Sometimes I hear colleagues in critical care talking about this, where a patient is left profoundly disabled after critical illness. And of course, that entails great suffering that we would not for a minute play down. But in referring to that as a fate worse than death, we're really connoting some concept of what it's like to be dead. And that's the great irony here is that in this rational calculus that I call the death calculus, people need to know not only what it's like to be alive, but also what it's like to be dead. And this is an issue that almost nobody talks about. And it's interesting, if you go back to Shakespeare's classic soliloquy in Hamlet, the thing when Hamlet is contemplating suicide in his famous to be or not to be soliloquy, it's his hesitation about what's after death that stops him. He writes, but that the dread of something after death, the undiscovered country from whose board no traveler returns, puzzles the will. And what's interesting is that in the modern West, with the advent of euthanasia, we appear to have lost any dread of something after death. It's no longer something to fear. Many people speak of that, that they're not afraid of death. And the question, of course, is on what basis? On what basis have we become confident? And because in reality, we have no empirical data speaking as scientists, or at least no reproducible empirical data as to what it's like to be dead. We may form beliefs about what it's like to be dead based on our, scientific atheism or our naturalistic materialism, but those are philosophies and quasi-religious belief systems. Those are not evidence-based scientific beliefs. And certainly physicians can speak with no authority about what it's like to be dead. There's no course in medical school about the afterlife because we really formally can't speak to that with any authority. And can you imagine any other medical intervention where the outcome is unknown and there's no possibility of following up with a patient? Anybody who practiced medicine that way would be regarded as a complete quack. Yet this is exactly what euthanasia is. This is an intervention where the physician who's performing it doesn't formally know what the outcome is in terms of what it's like to be dead. And of course, there's no possibility of following up with them. So it's very hard to rationally defend the practice once you see it from that standpoint. And I and others drew out that argument at some length in this paper here that you can refer to if you're interested to read more, as well as discuss that in my book, How Should We Then Die? So I want to close by just briefly grappling with what I think is the real problem. In many ways, assisted death is a symptom, not the primary disease itself. It's a kind of cry of despair that calls us to explore the real root problem. And this comes out because there's very good data now on why patients seek assisted death. They're not coming to seek assisted death because of uncontrolled physical agony. They're seeking it because of loss of autonomy, the fear of being a burden, the intolerability of losing the things that they love in life, becoming progressively more and more dependent on others, and starting to feel like life is pointless, that there's no point in going on. And strikingly, in many investigators or people describing the practice have observed this, that few patients cite inadequate pain control or other symptoms as their reason for seeking assisted death. This is not a practice that addresses physical suffering. This is a practice that addresses spiritual and existential suffering. And many practitioners of assisted death will be frankly acknowledge that really what they're addressing is is a different kind of suffering. And actually, for them, that's a powerful reason in its favor because else in medicine can do anything about those forms of suffering. There's no drug for spiritual and existential suffering, although people are now studying psychotropic agents like LSD, to at least alter the mental state of patients so that they are sort of numb to those kinds of symptoms. But the but the real purpose of euthanasia is not to address physical suffering, it's to address spiritual suffering. And really, I think what we have is in the modern West is a crisis of meaning. And this is a crisis of meaning that we can sort of get by with life when life's going reasonably well, when we're enjoying things, when we're sort of stimulated by life, when we're making progress, when there are pleasures that make it feel worthwhile. But if we do not have a deeper underlying purpose that's there no matter what, then when time comes for us to suffer, when life begins to rob us of the things we love and enjoy, then it seems like there's really no point in going on. This is something that Albert Camus in his kind of famed Myth of Sisyphus writes about. He's talking about the ethics of suicide, and he says dying voluntarily implies that you have recognized, even instinctively, the absence of any profound reason for living, the insane character of that daily agitation of bearing the suffering and trouble, and the uselessness of suffering. I think this is really the root issue here driving the demand for euthanasia is that people have come to believe that suffering is useless and that a life lived with unwanted suffering is essentially useless. There's no point. And it's that lack of meaning and purpose that's driving people to seek death. And so, just to put it very briefly, I honestly believe that we as Christians have the true medicine that people need to respond to the problem that drives the desire for death, the gospel, the message that God created us on purpose, that we're separated from him because of our sin and rebellion. Yet in Christ, he has done everything to reconcile us to himself such that we are welcomed back to live for him, to live with deep meaning and purpose that nothing can take from us, that no suffering can separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus. In the gospel, we behold just how much people matter. The idea that we're made in God's image. We see the true value of our bodies and the fact that God, the second person of the Trinity, took on human flesh, and in so doing, declared the glory and value of human flesh. The gospel gives us true knowledge and true confidence of what lies beyond the grave. And it's a great irony that although the Apostle Paul says it's better to depart and be with Christ, yet we don't choose death. We don't seek death. We wait for God to grant it because we understand that life, even with suffering, has deep meaning. And the gospel gives us faith in God's promises, in God's purposes, confidence that God is at work to will and to do according to his good purposes, hope in his promises that he will never leave us or forsake us, and fills us with and sheds abroad the love of God in our hearts through the Holy Spirit, such that even in the midst of suffering, pain, and loss, we can walk in joy and peace because we are walking in communion with the one who made us for himself. The gospel gives us a place of belonging, the body of Christ, such that we are always reminded just how much we matter because we belong in that body made visible, the church. And so the gospel really is the best medicine. It addresses all the issues that drive people to seek assisted death. And what we can offer them instead of assisted death is true life. So to summarize, we must recognize the true value of the person leads us to oppose euthanasia. The true value of the human body leads us to oppose euthanasia. Once we see that euthanasia is really a type of religious, quasi-religious ideology that's irrationally grounded in faith in death, we must oppose it. And once we recognize that the real problem here is finding meaning in suffering, that we're not simply going to offer people death, but rather our call is to bear witness to their value by refusing to participate in this practice. and to encouraging our churches and our church communities as the body of Christ in the world to be places of refuge where every single member in that body is reminded just how much they matter, no matter how weak, frail, vulnerable, or isolated they may be. And so our boast is in the cross. And of course, as physicians, we're limited in our capacity to share and bear witness to the gospel in the context of clinical interactions. We need to be very careful to avoid imposing or taking advantage of the patient-physician relationship. And I would emphasize that. Yet I hope and pray that we, in our personal witness, can be a means to help people remember just how much they matter. And I think as professionals standing strong against this practice, we bear witness to the truth in a powerful and effective way. A few resources that I want to highlight. Much of what I talked about here is summarized in my book, How Should We Then Die? My pastor and I wrote a catechism on death and dying for Christians that I think many people have found very helpful and very accessible. And then John Wyatt, who's a UK physician and ethicist, has written an excellent book addressing many of the issues around assisted suicide and end-of-life care that bears good reading. So I want to thank you very much for your time and attention, and I really look forward to your questions, comments, and insights.